We are protesting the American Psychiatric Association's annual meeting. While they are inside discussing their plans for bringing psychiatric drugs to the masses, we are out here speaking to the public about the other side of the story in the mental health world. I am joined here today with my guest, Al Galves. He is a clinical psychologist in New Mexico who believes that psychology is too valuable to be used only to help people with psychiatric diagnoses, but rather should be also used to help healthy people become healthier. He is the author of Harness Your Dark Side, Mastering Jealousy, Rage, Frustration, and Other Negative Emotions. Al is also a board member of MindFreedom International, an activist organization that fights for human rights in the mental health system. Thanks for being here today, Al.
Oh, it's good to be here, Jim. Yeah.
So the first question I always like to ask people is what their motivation is. What's their why? Why did you get involved in the mental health space? Why do you do the work that you do?
I got involved because I could see some bad things happening, Jim. Back in the 80s, I began to see a lot of promotion, really, advocacy, a lot of stuff saying that mental illnesses were caused by biochemistry and brain disorders and genetics and that kind of thing. And I could see it looked to me like that was going to go down the wrong path, and it has, because what's happened over those years since the early 1980s, more and more people are getting treated with the drugs and not benefiting from psychotherapy. And as you know, more and more Americans are on these drugs. I think about 25% of women between the ages of 40 and 65 are on antidepressants. And I could see that. It just seemed to me that was going in the wrong direction, because basically what it comes down to is you can't learn to live your life. You can't learn to love and work and express yourself by taking a pill. And that's what most people want. I mean, well, that's why people are mentally ill. The reason people are mentally ill, if you want to use that term, right? The reason people are mentally ill is because they're having a hard time living the way they want to live. And more specifically, most people want to be connected to other people in satisfying and enjoyable ways and meaningful ways. You know, so they want to love. They want to love in all kinds of ways: romantic love, sexual love, family love, friendship love, colleague love, you name it. Being connected and then satisfying again. And then people want to express themselves. You know, they want to use their abilities. We have all these abilities, Jim. You know, we have the ability to solve problems, to make decisions, to build things, to create all kinds of things, to create art. We have the ability to dance and sing and ski and play ball and understand the world and connect with other people. We have these amazing abilities, really, and we want to use them. And if we can't use them in a satisfying way, or we're not connected with other people in satisfying ways, we're going to become agitated and scared and mad and obsessive and anxious and upset. I mean, really upset. And we can get so upset that we really lose touch with reality, even if we get that upset, if we're that terrified, you know, about the world. We don't want to have to deal with the world. So that's what mental illness is all about, is how people are living their lives and concerns they have about themselves and their lives. You know, you can't work on that with a pill. A pill is not going to help people do that. It might help them feel better, feel a little bit better. It might stop their racing thoughts. Okay, and I can see that, you know, the value of that. It might keep them from killing themselves and other people. That's valuable, certainly enough. But that's only a short term, and it's only dealing with the symptoms. It's not dealing with the cause of what's going on. It's not fundamentally helping a human being learn to live his or her life. You know, so I can see that, and that seemed to me like a really bad thing. And in the case of people who with serious mental disorders, Jim. We're talking about schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, bipolar disorder with psychotic features, major depressive disorder with any kind of psychotic, state of being. The way we treat people in this country is horrible. I mean, it's not just not so good, it's horrible. And essentially what we do in this country is we take a person, who actually has fallen into a state of being that is going to be helpful for them if we can help them go through it, right? They've fallen into a state of being that actually is a move towards recovery, or certainly it's a move towards protecting themselves, avoiding pain, feeling more adequate, feeling more powerful, being more able to live in the world. That's what the psychosis is. It's helping a person be able to survive. And we take that person and we stop the process with a drug, with a powerful drug that's going to stop the process, going to dumb them down. And if they take it for more than a year or two, they're really going to be in bad shape. They're going to have Parkinson's disease, cognitive impairment, brain shrinkage, early death, diabetes. This is really bad. This is bad. So, I got involved in MindFreedom because I knew that David Oakes and his team, Janet Foner and Celia Brown and that group of people, they were fighting it, and they were really fighting the violation of human rights. So they themselves had been involuntarily committed to hospitals and had been forcibly treated. They knew how horrible that was. And so they said, like David, for instance, committed his life to doing what he could to stop that as a student at Harvard. He said, I'm going to spend my life stopping this stuff. So, it's a big problem. And unfortunately, people don't know how big it is. So I'll just say one more thing about it, okay? The people who shoot up schools and workplaces and universities and families, many of those people have been treated in the mental health system. For instance, the guy that shot up Virginia Tech, his last name was Ho, I think. So he'd been in the system. He'd been treated. He'd been given drugs. The system doesn't work. It doesn't help people. And so you get a guy like that who actually was in the mental health system. Many of these people have been in the mental health system. James Holmes, the guy that shot up the school, the theater in Aurora, Colorado. Eric Harris, the kid who shot up Columbine, they had all been treated. But they got the treatment so bad that it doesn't help them. It just hurts them. So you got a bad situation. And whenever you have a situation that bad, Jim, you got to fight it. You got to fight it.
Definitely. You brought up a lot of good points here. Let me try to circle back to some of the things you said in the beginning. So the common narrative that we hear usually about mental illness is that it means you were born with some sort of genetic disposition to have a neurochemical imbalance. And you mentioned early on when you were just talking that that's inaccurate. Can you talk a little bit about this common misconception and kind of where that might come from?
Yeah, well, where it comes from is that psychiatry, which is the discipline that runs the mental health system, because it's the highest qualified profession in the mental health system. Psychiatry, these are doctors, so they pretty much run the mental health system. In 1970s, early 70s, they decided to become a laboratory science, Jim. They wanted to become like other doctors. So they decided they were only going to pay attention to anything they could see in a laboratory, quantify, measure, see on a brain scan, study in the way that other doctors study things. Well, when you do that, you turn your back on human beings. You turn your back on human beings because you can't study what's important to human beings in a laboratory or in any kind of positivist science, where you're only paying attention to what you can quantify and measure and see. Because the things that matter to human beings, love and work and expressing themselves and living decent lives, you can't study that way. And so psychiatry turns back on human beings. And so And so the narrative, of course, because they want to be scientists, they have to explain, quote unquote, mental illnesses, these states of being. They have to explain it in a scientific way. So they come up with, oh, it's biochemistry, it's genetics, it's brain function. Now it gets complicated, Jim, because we do have brains, and we do have genes, and we do have chemistry. And if we didn't have that, we wouldn't be alive. So it's not like I'm saying, well, you don't have to think about those things or care about them. But they aren't important when it comes to mental illness. They're just not important. They're there, but they're not important. So, and see, the narrative has become backed up by so-called scientific evidence. So I'll give you an example of the kind of scientific evidence that makes it sound like they've really got something there, like the psychiatrists are into something. So if you look at the brains of people who are diagnosed with schizophrenia, you'll find that many of them have large ventricles, right? But it isn't clear enough to enable any psychiatrist to diagnose a mental illness through any kind of laboratory findings or brain scan. That is not done. People may be surprised to hear that. There is no diagnosing that's being done by looking at brain scans or anything that you can find or see in a laboratory. It's still done by listening to the person and asking them about what's going on, and what kind of symptoms they're experiencing, and that kind of thing. So, okay, but so many people diagnosed with schizophrenia have large ventricles in the brain. But that's just a finding. That's an association between schizophrenia and large ventricles. You don't know what that means. You don't know whether the state of being we call schizophrenia caused the large ventricles, or the large ventricles caused the schizophrenia. Right? We don't know. You don't know that. But they assume, the psychiatrists and the neuroscientists assume that it's the large ventricles that are causing the state of being. They don't have any right. They don't have any evidence on which to base that assumption. And if they use the principle of parsimony, this is a scientific principle that says when you have an unclear finding, you have a finding that you can use various interpretations, right? You have a finding, okay, large ventricles, schizophrenia. We have this finding. Now you can use various interpretations of that. Did the schizophrenia cause the large ventricles, or the large ventricles cause the schizophrenia? What you do in science is you look at other similar kinds of dynamics and to see what we know about them. So what you would do in this case is you would look at the stress response. That's a very much studied, widely and deeply studied mind-body dynamic. So what happens in the stress response? And the stress response, there's a profound physiological reaction covering the whole body. Your heart starts pumping more blood. The blood carries more oxygen. You secrete, your endocrine system secretes noradrenaline, norepinephrine, dopamine, many neurotransmitters. Your blood flow to the extremities is reduced. Your pain threshold goes up. Blood flows to your heart, your brain, and your muscles. This is profound. But it doesn't just happen. It doesn't come out of the blue like a psychiatrist would say, well, the biochemistry of the large ventricles just came out of the blue, right? But in the stress response, it doesn't come out of the blue. No. What happened was the person perceived something. They saw a threat, or they're going to have to do something that's going to be hard. Some demand has been placed upon them, and they see it. So they have this perception and this cognition, and then the stress response comes. So it's the psychological state of being that caused the physiology, right? That's clear in the stress response. Well, why wouldn't we think the same thing about schizophrenia then, or depression, or bipolar disorder? What I would say, well, it must be the state of being that this person is in, what they're perceiving, what they're thinking, what they're reacting to. It must be that's changing the brain. That's what we would think. Of course, the psychiatrists think exactly the opposite, because they want to be scientists and they want to be like other doctors. So that's to give you some idea about what's going on. And so there's this whole, as you know, there's this whole mass of belief that, oh yeah, these are just physiological illnesses, they don't have anything to do with a person's life or what they've experienced. But of course, if you really call people on that, they will admit. I mean, most people will probably say, "Oh, well, no, yeah, it does have to do with people's lives, what happened to them." And then you say, "Well, but then why are you saying that it's biochemistry or genetics or the brain?" And then they go, "Oh, yeah, that's a good point." So people are very confused about it, actually.
Sure, and actually, one thing that MindFreedom International is quite famous for, I suppose you say, is forcing the folks in power to kind of answer to these types of questions. And so I wanted to ask if you could share about the hunger strike back in, I think it was 2003, that David Oakes and MindFreedom organized, and I believe you were part of the scientific advisory board that kind of was involved in the looking at the responses from the APA and NAMI and the Surgeon General, right? Can you tell me a little bit about that story?
Yeah, that was really created by a guy named Mickey Weinberg. Mickey had worked with people who had been diagnosed with mental illnesses. He was a social worker, and he saw this beginning use of drugs, as the primary modality of treatment, and he could see that was a bad thing. That was going to hurt people. And so he wanted to show the general public. He wanted to show people. He wanted to have the general public see that, look, there's no scientific foundation behind this idea that mental illnesses are caused by biochemistry and genetics and brain function. There's no scientific evidence behind it, not sufficient, and these drugs are hurting people. And there's no scientific evidence that the drugs correct chemical imbalances or that they aren't harmful. And so what he said is, we're gonna have a hunger strike. And he and 5 other people committed themselves to not taking any solid food until the American Psychiatric Association, the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill, NAMI, and the Surgeon General provided them with scientific evidence. So they put the word out to those 3 organizations. NAMI sent back a letter saying, "Oh, this is ridiculous. Why don't you people spend your time doing something worthwhile?" That was NAMI's response. The Surgeon General didn't respond. The American Psychiatric Association actually sent a textbook, a citation of a textbook, which they said, well, there's evidence in here for the the biochemistry and the genetics and the brain function, and these drugs are really work, and they're a very good treatment for mental illness, and they don't hurt people. So they sent us this textbook. Well, we had a scientific panel of about 10 people: David Cohen, David Healy, Mary Boyle, Joanna Moncrief, Peter Bregan, Joe Tarantolo, Bruce Levine, all PhDs or MDs. Okay, Jonathan Leo, who's a professor in a medical school. So we looked at the evidence, and basically what we did was find in that textbook itself evidence that debunked what they were saying. Words that said there's no way of diagnosing mental illnesses through the use of any kind of laboratory science. There's no evidence. We don't know what the chemical balance of serotonin is in the brain, or we don't know what the correct balance of any neurotransmitter is in the brain. So how can we know what the imbalance is, right? So basically, the scientific panel, we just debunked it and wrote back and said, no, this is not sufficient evidence. And so after about 28 days, the panel said, well, we're going to start eating because, you haven't done it. Well, unfortunately, it wasn't picked up by the media in the amount or the spread or the broadcasting that Mickey and the group had wanted. Unfortunately, it was covered. There was a New York Times guy who wrote a story on it, Shankar Vedantam, yeah. There were a couple stories in the Los Angeles Times. NPR had something on it, but it didn't get widespread attention. So actually, Mickey now is working on an effort to get the Congress to pass a law requiring a psychological investigation of anybody who shoots up a school, workplace, or a family. The idea being to, let's take a look. Let's see how many of these people were on psychotropic drugs and how many of these people were treated in the system. And we know that there's some evidence that psychotropic drugs increase the risk of suicide and violence because there's a black box warning on all antidepressants that says this drug increases the risk of suicide and violence. Well, that's true of all. There's evidence that's true of all psychotropics. So Mickey's working on that now. Again, the idea being to alert the public, to illuminate this for the general public that these drugs are not good, they're dangerous, and psychiatry is not to be dependent on. We should not be depending on psychiatry to protect us, to help us in any way. So, yeah, that was the hunger strike. Mickey's still doing it.
Wow, that's great. I got to talk to him.
Yeah. Oh yeah, he'd be a good guy to talk to, Mickey Weinberg.
Okay. There's two different directions I might go with this. Let's go through this thread. You mentioned when me and you first met, it was last spring, before the APA conference that was happening in San Diego. You were on a panel about involuntary commitment. And one thing that I will never forget from that conversation that we had, you probably don't realize this, like, lit up this big light bulb in my head, was I was asking you, what's keeping MindFreedom from making a huge impact and changing the world in a big way? And you said money. And I said, yeah, well, everyone says that. Like, what's the money for? And I thought you were going to tell me that, we need money for marketing to spread the word about the truth and what's going on and to make people aware of these injustices in the mental health system. And you really surprised me because you said to me, what we need money for is lawyers, that ideally we'd have a team of lawyers. Can you share with the viewers a little bit about why it's actually the battle to be fought is actually in a courtroom and with legislature? Because again, to me, that was like a wake-up call for me to kind of realize, what are the tools that activists need to do to make change? Do we need more scientists and doctors? Like, what do we need to do? And you really, it kind of blew my mind when you brought up lawyers.
Yeah, well, when it comes to involuntary commitment, that's what we need. Because typically what happens is a person is committed involuntarily. And as you know, by now, in all 50 states, you can be committed even if you're not in a hospital or in any kind of institution. You can be living in your home and you can be forced to take antipsychotic drugs by court order against your will. And of course, those drugs are extremely toxic. We talked about that already. So you can be forced. Typically, you have 3 days. And within 3 days, there has to be a hearing. And you have a right to counsel. What happens, since most people who are in this state are not very wealthy, they can't hire a lawyer. $300 an hour, and probably more than that if the lawyer is going to be in a trial situation. People don't have that kind of money. So they get appointed public defenders. Well, the public defenders are way overworked. I don't know if you've ever had an experience with a public defender. Typically, they have such a high caseload that they'll talk to the person for a minute before the hearing, and also they are bought in to the biopsychiatric narrative, to what I call the NAMI ideology. They're bought into that. They believe it the way 95% of Americans believe it. Yeah, this is all chemical stuff, and you just need to be drugged. So they believe that, and so they do a horrible job of defending people. They don't do it. They do a horrible job. What can I say? Of defending people. So what we need is lawyers who are like Jim Gottstein. You know Jim Gottstein, and you know our viewers or whoever looking could go to www.psychrights.org and learn about what lawyers have to do and the kind of evidence that Jim has used to win court cases in Alaska, in which he basically got a person off from involuntary commitment because his argument was that you have to provide the best alternative treatment. And if you don't provide that, you don't have a right to involuntarily commit somebody. And the state of Alaska wasn't providing proper alternative, less intrusive treatment. So we need a cadre of lawyers in every state and every city ready to go and defend people who are being involuntarily committed. And okay, there are some people who probably should be involuntarily committed. You know, if they're going to kill themselves, I don't think it's a good idea for people to kill themselves. Or if they really are in danger of hurting somebody, you know, the evidence says that people diagnosed with serious mental disorders like schizophrenia are not likely to be more violent than other people unless they're using illegal drugs. Well, what if you got somebody who is diagnosed with schizophrenia, is using illegal drugs, is dangerous? You know, well, I certainly think we ought to protect innocent people. I don't want any innocent person to be hurt by anybody. But the reason we need money, because we need to hire lawyers. We need to be able to pay lawyers to represent people in these hearings so that the ones who shouldn't be committed don't get committed. Yeah, that's it.
Sure, and then let's talk a little bit about involuntary treatment and kind of the damage that it causes and what the experience is of people that are involuntarily committed. Because I know on that panel discussion, the authors had written that book, Committed, which is actually, I think it's a pretty good book. It kind of shows the arguments for and against involuntary commitment and involuntary treatment. Can you talk a little bit about what that looks like for people that actually experience psychiatric hospitalizations and forced treatments and why it's such a damaging thing?
Yeah, well, of course, involuntary commitment, forced treatment almost by itself is clearly not going to work very well, because when you force a person into treatment, they don't want to be treated. And so if they don't want to be treated, it's very unlikely that that treatment is going to be effective. And in fact, Dinah Miller, who wrote the book that you just mentioned, Committed, while she was writing that book, she put the word out to people very widely who had been involuntarily committed, and she asked them to communicate with her, let her know what it was like. And many, many, many people who had been involuntarily committed basically told her it was horrible, it wasn't helpful when they look back on it, and it didn't help them. And basically nobody, I think pretty sure she said nobody said, communicated with her and said, hey, well, I think the treatment was good for me, even though I didn't want it at the time and it was involuntary forced, I think it turned out to be a good thing. Nobody did that. So, which is not surprising. If you talk to someone like a David Oakes or a Janet Foner or Celia Brown, what happens to them is they are involuntarily committed. They are forcibly drugged. The drug is horrible. They know it's horrible. They know what it's doing to them. And in the case of David, he said, look, no, I'm not doing it. I am not letting you do that. You are not going to inject that into me. No way. And so he ended up being put in solitary confinement in the hospital for I don't know how long. And that happened. That may have happened. That happens to a lot of people. They say, look, these drugs are horrible. I don't want. Well, then they get put into solitary confinement, maybe even, straitjackets. It's happened. Restraints. And essentially, if they want to leave the hospital, well, of course, some of these units are locked units. If you're involuntarily committed, you're committed to a locked unit. You can't get out. So, you know, and to give you an example also how dangerous this is. There's a famous study done by a guy named Rosenhands, and what he did was he had some people who were students go to psychiatrists and fake symptoms, and they were put into mental hospitals. They were not ill, and they were put in the mental hospitals. They couldn't get out. They couldn't get out because they would tell people, "Look, I'm okay, I'm okay," and the staff would not let them out. They say, "Hey, you're just faking. You're just faking." But they had to get. I don't know how they finally got out. Maybe they left against medical advice. So, you know, there's a lot of violations of human rights going on, essentially what you're talking about. And this is interesting. You know, there have been big movements to overcome the human rights violations for African Americans, for Hispanics, for gays, lesbians, transgender, but not so much for people diagnosed with mentally ill. That's a group of people who really, there hasn't been a very effective movement to advocate for their human rights. And that's why you're protesting. That's why you're protesting at the American Psychiatric Association, because psychiatrists are the people who are putting people in to hospitals and committing them to treatment against their will. Yeah.
So let's talk. One reason I feel like the movement for people, psychiatric survivors, let's use that term, that they have a challenge in speaking out because there's a lot of stigma, and you know, people don't want to be self-identified as being a mentally ill person. And when you look at some of those other populations that you talk about, whether it was the civil rights movement with Black people, like people can tell if a Black person is Black. They can't hide in any way. They wear that all day long. You know, women that get discriminated against, you could tell a woman's a woman most of the time, and like you can't hide that. Whereas, for example, gay people, for the most part, you can't tell somebody's gay. I mean, somebody might dress in a particularly flamboyant way or something like that. Fine, I guess, but most of the time, you can't tell that somebody's gay. And so that is kind of like this idea of like being in the closet versus being out of the closet. And it seems like with the mental health population, for lack of a better term, they kind of struggle with that same stigma of not being able to be like out about their experience. And because of that, not as many people are out there organizing and coming together and being public about it. Is that something that you've seen? Could you talk a little bit about, you know, kind of the stigma and kind of how that's affected the movement?
That's a good point. I hadn't really thought about that very much, but I think it's a good point. You know, yeah, certainly, if people do come out and you know, say that they've been hospitalized, that they've been diagnosed with serious mental disorders, they can be marginalized. They can be belittled and discounted because people can say, well, you know, that person's not all there. I mean, they're mentally ill, so we don't really going to pay a lot of attention to them. I think that is a problem. Now, when it comes to stigma, this is I think really interesting. You know, one of the reasons why NAMI, which is the most active and the biggest advocacy organization for mentally ill people, I think one of the reasons why they've glommed on, or why they've really supported and promote this idea that mental illnesses are caused by biochemistry and genetics and brain function. One of the reasons they did that was because it seems to be less blaming, right? You know, oh, it's just a physiological thing came over this person. You know, it seems to be less stigmatizing and less blaming. But of course, you know, I would never blame anybody for having a mental illness, quote unquote, because people don't choose their parents. They don't choose their early life. And their early life can have tremendous impact on their later life. I mean, it does, it does. Our early lives, the first 18 years of our lives have tremendous impact on us. We don't choose that. So the idea of blaming people for their behavior or the state of being they're in doesn't make any sense to me. But it turns out that there's been a study done on this, if people are told that a quote unquote mentally ill person is that way because of brain disorder, biochemical imbalance, and genetics, rather than what's happened in their lives and difficulties they've had in their lives and having a hard time with the situation they're in and concerns about themselves and their lives, if they are told that people are quote unquote mentally ill because of the physiological things, they treat them more harshly. They tend to treat them more harshly. They tend to be more stigma on those people because they're seen as broken. If you see that about it, if you believe a person's that way because of this physiology stuff, you see them as being broken. If you see it as being something that's has to do with a person's life and difficulties in living their life the way they want to, you don't see them as quite broken. You see them as just having undergone a hard time. So it's interesting because that turns out that the NAMI ideology is more stigmatizing.
Wow, yeah, that's a good point, because then you think they have some sort of genetic difference. You think, oh, they're almost a different species of human. They're lower in the barrel. So
yeah, what are they going to do about biochemistry or brain function? Can't do anything about it except for take a drug.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's interesting. Yeah.
Something else kind of along these lines of let's call them vulnerable, populations of people. One thing that I found, and I could I could do a screen share so you can see this document that I'm going to point out. So this, I got my hands on a copy of the program that the APA is using for their event, and they have several different tracks. Are you able to see my screen, what I'm posting here?
I'm going to see it here. Yeah.
So this is the different tracks that they have for their for the APA meeting, where you can follow these different tracks and take workshops and courses. And so when I look at the different topics of what they're discussing at their event, one of them is about addiction psychiatry. So how to bring treatment. And by the way, this entire thing, it says treatment everywhere. It never on here says drugs that we're going to give patients. So they've specifically used the term treatment all over the place without ever saying psychiatric drugs on here. And so they have people who are suffering from addiction. They have one here for children and adolescents. Consultation liaison means dealing with people with multiple issues. Then they have forensic psychiatry, which is people that are in prisons. And then they have geriatric psychiatry, which is people that are elderly. So when I look at this, it looks like, okay, you're going after people that are having issues with addiction, and you're going after children and teenagers. You're going for people that are in prison, and then you're going for the elderly. And many of these people, specifically children that are in the school system and prisoners that are in jails, and you've got elderly people in nursing homes. These are people that often don't get to make decisions about their own treatment. There are people that, either they're being told through teachers and administrators, or you've got, you're in jail and you're having drugs forced on you there, or you're in a nursing home and other people are. Can we talk a little bit about this idea of having the APA having a discussion about how to utilize these sales channels and market channels? Because I'm an entrepreneur, I get it. It's like, how do you reach customers? How do you spread your product to people? And we have certain systems set up where there's populations that don't get to make decisions about their health care. Let's go after those people.
Yeah, well, that's certainly the case. Well, in those three cases, that's an interesting point. Yeah. In those three cases, children really don't have informed consent. They don't have a right to informed consent, which adults have. And so they get drugged in large numbers, as you know, without giving consent. That's certainly true in jails also. I'm sure, although I don't have direct evidence of that there's pressure put on prisoners to take drugs. And I'm sure that they're forced to take drugs at certain circumstances. And in nursing homes, I'm not sure that people are forced to take the drugs, but they are given them in large numbers. What happens is people will get agitated in the nursing home. They'll get mad and angry, and they'll start acting out, and they'll be given a antipsychotic like that to dumb them down, basically. Yeah, so that goes on way too much. And then the worst case is really children. You take the numbers of kids that are prescribed, that are given, that are forced to take Ritalin and Adderall and Cylert and Strattera. And well, in the case of Ritalin and Adderall, that's speed. Those are amphetamines. Those are on the DEA's, the Drug Enforcement Administration's controlled substance list. They have bad side effects. They stunt growth. They increase the risk that kids will be addicted in later life. So they're forced to take these drugs. Now, why are they forced to take the drugs? Because they're in school and they're not paying attention. They're being disruptive. They're being difficult in some ways. Well, the school never considers the possibility that maybe the reason this kid is not paying attention to the teacher or not sitting in his or her seat is because something's going on at home that scared them. It's got them very upset. And it really doesn't make any difference to them what's going on in that classroom when they're concerned about their parents and their family. I can tell you my son was a kid like that. He didn't care because he had been hurt in the first year of his life. He had a very difficult first year of his life. All he cared about was having friends. He didn't care about what the teacher was doing at all. What if the kid is just not getting it? They're not getting it. And so who wants to be in a room where you're not getting it and everybody else is? Maybe the kid is totally bored and just is bored out of his mind. Maybe there's some other conflict going on in the class that he's having a hard time with. There could be all kinds of reasons why a kid is not paying attention in a classroom or being disruptive. But the schools never consider those possibilities because that would mean they have to change. The schools would have to change. So they say, oh no, this kid is sick. We're going to give him this drug. And it turns out that if you look at the research on the drugs, on those drugs, children in the long run, they don't do better academically than control groups. They don't develop emotional maturity. They become emotionally stunted. It's not good for them. It's mainly done for the purposes of the school, not for the purposes of the kid. This is pretty horrible, really.
Yeah, so we've talked about a lot of negative things. Let's talk about some positives. I know that you're doing a series of talks right now about. I know one of your talks is what is mental illness and what is good treatment for it. I know you have another talk, schizophrenia. What is it and what is a good treatment for it? So, and I know you're also running here in Voices groups now. Let's talk about some of the positive ways of helping people and what is actually working. We kind of bashed the hell out of psychiatric drugs and that approach. Let's talk about some things that are working.
Yeah, well, okay. Yeah. Well, I think psychotherapy, works. In fact, the research on psychotherapy finds that if you ask people who have been patients or clients of psychotherapy, 80% of them, and all the studies I've ever seen, 80% of them say it was helpful. The more psychotherapy they received, the more helpful it was. It really didn't make any difference what the credentials of the therapist were, for the most part. But it's helpful. So psychotherapy is helpful to people because what it does is help people learn how to manage themselves so they can live more the way they want to live. That's what psychotherapy is about. And it helps people become more comfortable with who they are, more accepting of who they are, with all their faults and their fears and their ridiculous stuff and the stupidity that we all do, they become much more accepting of themselves, more compassionate for themselves, more able to live with themselves, and then becoming able to manage themselves so they can live the way they want to live and manage stress and manage their thoughts and get along with other people without giving up too much of themselves. And so the psychotherapy is very helpful. And I define psychotherapy very broadly, so I don't just include meeting with a therapist. There's also yoga, exercise, art therapy, dance therapy, music therapy, other expressive therapies. Buddhism is a form of therapy. Support groups, help with relationships, help with getting jobs. We take psychotherapy and look at it broadly. It's very helpful to people. And so when it comes to people with serious mental disorders, things like schizophrenia, psychotic disorders, well, we know that the Soteria houses like the Soteria House help people. And there is one now in Vermont, Soteria, Vermont. It's funded by the state of Vermont. What happens in Soteria is person basically who begins to experience psychotic symptoms, hallucinations, delusions, disorganized thinking, they are invited to come into a house, home-like residence, and the message they get is, come on in, you can stay here as long as you want. We're going to help you be safe here, safe psychologically and physically. We're not going to put pressure on you to get better. We're not going to put pressure on you to go back the way you were. We're going to help you go through this experience. We assume that this experience you've fallen into, this state you've fallen into, there must have some meaning in your life. It must have some purpose. And so we're going to help you go through it in a safe place. Well, that works. There's been studies done at Soteria that works. And then you have open dialogue, which was developed in Finland, in which the first sign of psychosis, a couple of professionals go out to the family, meet with the person, and they set up some meetings. And they ask the person, who would you like to come to these meetings? And then they meet every day or every other day for 2 or 3 weeks with the professionals, creating an environment in which people are free to talk about what's happened. And there's a tolerance of uncertainty in an environment. We don't know what happened. Let's talk. Let's open this up. Let's be open to whatever happens and go with wherever it goes. And so people are talking. Siblings, parents, aunts, uncles, coaches, boyfriends, girlfriends, teachers, all talking. And every once in a while, at opportune times, the professionals will stop the conversation and they'll talk among themselves. Say, I'm interested in what so-and-so said. I'd love to hear more about that. You know, I think that the patient would be a good idea if she or he, they thought about what so-and-so said, maybe began to wonder about this, or whatever it might be. And then they keep on talking, and all decisions are made in the presence of everybody, and that works. In Finland, they report an 80% recovery rate from 80% full recovery rate from schizophrenia, from psychotic disorder. So in Soteria and open dialogue, drugs aren't the primary modality of treatment. And then you have an approach in Sweden in which people who are diagnosed with serious disorders are placed with families who have been trained in how to help this person go through this experience in a safe place. And the family gets supervised, and the patient gets therapy. That works. And there's a woman now who's an American woman who learned about that and who has started a housing project in New York called Broadway Housing Corporation. I forget her name, but if you look at Broadway Housing Corporation, so yeah, these good things happen. And you know about the Hearing Voices Network, and that's a terrific movement now. In this country, there are more and more hearing voices groups being created. And these are groups where people hear voices or have visions or, you know, have unusual experiences. They get together, they just share with each other their experience, they learn from each other, they become more comfortable with whatever's going on, don't see it as a disease, as pathological, and they learn how to engage with their voices, perhaps, manage their voices, develop relationships with their voices. so that they become less intrusive and less problematic. So these are, yeah, good things are happening. Hearing Voices Network is really a terrific thing. And it's, the interesting thing about these, Jim, is that they don't sound very medical, They don't sound very scientific. They really, you're just going to have people get together and hear voices, and they're just going to share with each other. And yeah, that works. People really get help by that, and they eventually recover from that kind of experience. You mean just giving people a place in which they can safely go through the experience that they're having is, yes, it works. And just having people talk about what's happened, yeah, it doesn't seem very medical, it's not very scientific. But it works.
That's great. I love it. Now I can attest that the Hearing Voices groups are really great. I've been to a bunch of them, and I found it to be really helpful. I wish that I had the opportunity to go and do like an open dialogue thing that wasn't available when I was having a lot of issues. That would have been, from everything I've heard about it, it sounds great. And I've met Chris Gordon, who's the American doctor that's been running open dialogue in the United States. So it's
yeah, over
really
there at Advocates. Yeah.
So one thing that I wanted to make sure that we talked about before we kind of wrap this up is you've in your writing, you've talked about how you think that psychotherapy and even all of kind of these different tools for mental health should be things that healthy people are using to be more healthy, and that we shouldn't just think of these as tools that are used to repair the most broken of us that are struggling with severe mental illness. But these tools are really things that anybody can use and really could benefit from. Could you talk a little bit about kind of your approach with that, or your kind of your thesis on kind of bring mental health benefits to everybody?
Yeah, that's a good question. When it comes to psychotherapy, I don't know. I think it's true that there aren't enough psychotherapists in the country, and there aren't enough good ones. Okay, now that's an evaluation. That's a value judgment I'm making, right? But by good ones, I mean, not ones who basically are just going to do medication management and are going to send you to a psychiatrist right away as soon as they feel like they can't help you or they get concerned. So good there aren't enough of them. In my town, for instance, virtually all the psychotherapists are full. I have people call me up wanting an appointment. They say, I can't find anybody who take me on. So we need more psychotherapists. Now, I never had a problem with the insurance companies putting pressure on me to have less sessions or to stop or anything. So that doesn't seem to be much of a problem. But we need more psychotherapists, and we need to be willing to pay more for it, I think, the biggest place we can make a difference, Jim, is in the schools. Everybody goes to public school, virtually everybody. And I think that a major part of the curriculum in public school ought to be psychotherapy. What do I mean by that? Children ought to be taught how to use their emotions, how to experience their emotions and learn from their emotions, because their emotions are really important to help them live their lives. People ought to be able to learn how to manage their thoughts. Through cognitive behavioral therapy, just have the experience of learning how to manage their thoughts, learn how to relate to other people and without giving up too much of themselves, learn how to manage stress, learn how to deal with fear, learn how to manage fear and understand fear and be able not to let it get in the way too much. Learn how to manage themselves, manage this organism. And in order to do that, you can't just learn about how to think up here. You got to learn how to use your emotions and your bodily sensations also. So I think that would be a major part of curriculum in school. And I don't know, you have some other ideas about how to do this, I don't know.
What do you think? Do you think there's a cultural aspect of our society too that doesn't embrace people talking about emotions and feelings? And there seems to be this idea of professionalism, and that you should keep everything buried deep down to show your best self. And by the way, I think that people give the impression that it's like, oh, this is a thing millennials invented with social media and just showing off their best selves on the internet and that type of thing. But I mean, I look at it as something that seems to be professionals, that people of all ages, and they try to get their career face on, and they want to look proper. I think maybe it's broadcast through social media, but I kind of see this as more of a cultural thing that's been around for a very long time. Is this something that you see too? And if it is, like, what could actually be done to shift culture and the way people view emotions and talking? Because a lot of these things you're talking about is just people being open, having conversations that are hard to have.
Yeah, oh, wow, that's a big one. That's big. That's big. Yeah, one of the things about our society is that our society values extroversion and thinking. Extroversion and thinking. Extroverted people who are out there, who like to be with other people, who are personable and right, and thinking. Other societies, for instance, India is a good example. They value introversion, being quiet, being by yourself, and feeling. That's the value. There's a value placed on feeling in India. So it's a different society. So, people who go there will see that even though there's a lot of poverty in India, people seem to be quite happy. The other thing about our culture is that, we have this myth in this country that we've all been imbued with, really. It's sort of like we get imbued with it. And so the myth is that we're the greatest country in the world, all right? And everyone in this country has an equal opportunity to be rich, famous, successful, exalted, etc. And so if you're not, it's your fault. If you're not rich, famous, successful, because you have an equal opportunity. Of course, that's not true at all. We don't have an equal opportunity at all. There are people who are born into families in which they're going to be raised in a wonderful environment, in which there are lots of economic resources, in which they're going to be very healthy. Those people are going to have a good time in life. And they're going to be successful. You're born to a 15-year-old mother who is married to a crack addict, who is really not capable of being a mother, doesn't want to be a mother. You are not going to have an easy time. You may be able to overcome that early life, but it's going to be hard. So turns out we don't have an equal opportunity at all. But because we have that belief, we have to counterfeit. If we're not doing as well as other people, we use all kinds of ways of counterfeiting. We buy a new car every 60,000 miles, which is ridiculous. Car is going to go 250,000 miles. Why would you buy a new one at 60,000? Well, the reason is because you want to show people that you're doing well. We buy a house that's 4 times as big as it needs to be. We go on vacations we can't afford. We drive cars we can't afford. We counterfeit. And then, unfortunately, and this is really the worst part of it, is we have to have a group of people that we are better than, that we believe we're better than, and that we're better than because this group that's lower than us is that way because they're lazy and immoral, not because they didn't have a chance. And so we point the finger at these poor people, and we don't help them. So, yeah, our society is not an easy society to live in, not at all. It's a very difficult society to live in. If you're not doing well in other societies, let's say England. Well, England has a class system. If you're born in a Cockney neighborhood, you don't expect to become very successful or rich or famous. If you're born into an India caste, if you're born into the untouchable caste in India, you don't expect to be. And so if you're not, you don't blame yourself for it. It's because of the class you were born into or the caste you were born into. In this country, it's not that way. If you're not doing well, it's your own fault. And yeah. So our culture is difficult. But how do you change a culture? Well, I don't have any idea about that. That's going to take a long time. Schools, I mean, the potential for schools making a difference is really great. But as you know, we've talked about this before. Our schools, unfortunately, don't use the most powerful educational force there is in the world, which is the desire of a human being to learn what he or she wants to learn, when they want to learn it, and how they want to learn it. That's the most powerful educational force in the world. Because if a human being wants to learn something, and they have basic ability to do it, they will. Well, the schools don't make any use of that force. They essentially ignore it. So schools, are not nearly as good as they ought to be. Much too oppressive and inhumane, forcing a curriculum down people's throats, basically not really helping people learn what they want to learn. So the schools could do much better.
Sure. A lot of parallels to the psychiatric system of being oppressive and forcing things down people's throat they don't want to take.
Yeah, exactly. The other thing that we could do, and Jim, we know how to do this, is we could help at-risk mothers. We know who the at-risk mothers are. Young mothers, uneducated, out of low-income areas, mothers living with alcoholic fathers, single mothers with no income. We know who at-risk mothers are. We can provide them with the help, really good help, trained social workers, nurses, psychologists, available to them on a 24/7 basis. It's been done where each of the professionals has only 3 mothers to work with. So they're ready to go. Mom calls up, says, I'm losing it. Please come over. They do it. They'll come over. And they work with the women 6 months before birth and for a year and a half or 2 years after, helping them raise their children. Well, that make a big difference. We could do that, but we're not willing to do it. We're spending $700 billion a year on our military budget, basically killing people and finding bigger and better ways of killing people. 10% of that, $70 billion, is used for weapons that the armed forces don't even want. It's a job program for scientists and engineers. And with $1 billion, you can pay 20,000 people $40,000 a year with very good fringe benefits. So with $1 billion, 20,000 people, nurses, psychologists, counselors, social workers, teachers, doctors, we have resources in this country, but we use them, we misuse them big time.
That's all the questions I had. Is there anything else that you want to share with anybody who's watching? Any last burning desires?
I think I've talked way too much. I'm sorry for having talked so much.
No, this is great. That's why you're here, is to talk.
Yeah, right.
I didn't bring you on here to be quiet.
As you can tell, I don't have any I'm not bashful about talking. And as my kids gave me a mug, says everyone's entitled to my opinion. So everyone's entitled to my opinion. So I appreciate you giving me a chance to do this, Jim.
No, it's been great having you on. And if people want any more information about your work and your book, is there somewhere they can follow up with you, or your website or anything like that?
Well, my website's www.algalves.com. You can call me at 575-571-3105 or email me at agalves2003@comcast.net. I'd love to hear from people.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Al, for being on the show.
Okay, thanks, Jim. Have a good day.